So these two gentlemen were shipwrecked on a desert isle, and one of them is just ranting. No food, no water, we're gonna die. And the other one is just casual and smiling and leaning against a palm. And the distressed one says, man, don't you see the seriousness of this situation? And the relaxed says, well, I make $10,000 a day. And his friend says, so what? What is money? It means nothing on this deserted island. We're going to starve here or die of thirst here. It means nothing. And the fellow under the palm tree just smiled and said, don't worry. Like I said, I make $10,000 a day. I tithe. My pastor will find us. Hey, I just want to tell you something right off the bat. Don't count on me to be like that man's pastor. I don't own a boat. Besides that, I don't know how much you make, and more importantly, I definitely do not know how much you give. I am not privy to that information here at CCY. I don't want to be. In fact, no one knows those figures here of what you give except a very, very few. And those individuals are sworn to secrecy, including the signing of a confidentiality waiver. Do I need to do something, do you think, maybe, to help you out? Stop clearing my throat. No, that wasn't me clearing my throat. Hey, if you decide if it's a bother, just put me onto this one. Yeah. If I were to come looking for you, it would be for a much more significant reason than how much you give. I would be coming looking for you because of your commitment to Christ. From a purely pragmatic perspective, your value to this church, to CCY, is directly related not to how much you give, but to your dedication to Jesus Christ. Speaking of that, let me ask you a question. Would you betray him? Would you betray the Lord? Now, I know most of us would quickly answer, no, never, just like Peter, right? So let me ask you this question instead. Do you love cash? Now, most of us would have to think just a little bit longer about that one, right? Some of us remember the old show, Let's Make a Deal. Monty Hall. And he would always ask that question, during that show, maybe more than once. Do you want what's behind that door? Do you want what's behind door number 2, or do you want to keep the cash? Oh, the consternation on the person's face as they looked at that question, that door, and looked at that cash and considered that question. How about it? Are you going to keep the cash? Here's why I'm asking this question this morning, okay? You see, the love of cash invites the betrayal of Christ. Catch that? The love of cash invites the betrayal of Christ. When Satan was looking for a betrayer among the 12, he chose the cash lover. He chose Judas. And he was right. It worked. So here's what we're going to do this morning, something a little different. We're going to look at the life of Judas, so we'll be moving around a little bit in the Gospels. And as we look at the life of Judas, we're going to find some facts about the love of cash. Here's one. It begins as well hidden. The love of cash begins as well hidden. John 13, we have to go there if we're going to be discussing the life of Judas. In verse 21, after he had said this, and this is when they're all seated there at the Passover meal, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "Very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me." And his disciples stared at one another, at a loss as to know which one he meant. Can you picture the stunned silence after Jesus makes that statement and they all are just looking at one another? And one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and we know that was John, was reclining next to him, next to Jesus. So Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, Ask him which one he means." Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." And then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, "What you're about to do quickly." But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him, because it was well hidden. The love of cash, it begins as well hidden. Even after 3 years, companions of Judas, they didn't understand. They didn't see the betrayal in him. It was hidden. Judas was perhaps the most trusted among those 12 by the other 11. We read it. He had charge of the money, or we're going to read that eventually. He had charge of the money. Let's look back a chapter. Let's look back at the 12th chapter and see what we can learn. Jesus is in the home of some real close friends of his, okay? And they're all having a meal. Then Mary, one of those close friends, took about a pint of pure nard. This is John 12:3. An expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, something John didn't know at the time, objected. "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." Now listen to what John says, because John did not know at the time, but he figured it out later. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. The love of cash was so well rooted in Judas early on, but so unseen and unaware of it others. His words here appear to be from this benevolent spirit, concern for the poor, but all that was an appearance. He was just putting on an appearance. Beware when people sound too spiritual, especially their words. They might be hiding something. You know, back at the turn of the century, and I don't mean 1900, I mean 2000, the average poor American gave $520 to charity. The average rich American gave $1,600. Nearly 3 times as much. Well, that sounds impressive, doesn't it? But not really. Because in fact, the poor Americans' gift represented 5.2% of their income. The rich's gift was represented by 1.6%. Appearances. Oh, they can be deceiving. In an analysis by the Chronicle of Philanthropy, done just a few years ago, they were looking at people's giving before and after 2008. Now, what happened in 2008? Well, we had what we call the recession. Some would even call it a depression. Okay, here's what they found. If an individual earned $200,000 or more a year, after 2008, they gave 5% less to charity in the aftermath of that recession. Those who earned $100,000 or less gave 5% more during that same period. But guess who gave the most? The poorest. The poorest Americans, $25,000 or less a year, increased their giving by 17% after 2008. Betrayal is always an inside-out matter. So we ought to ask ourselves, Christians, followers of Jesus who claim him as Lord, what's going on deep inside us? Are we growing? Are you growing more tight-fisted than ever? The love of cash. Be careful. The love of cash invites the betrayal of Christ, and it begins almost unseen. It's well hidden. And as it moves along, secondly, it develops a stubborn resolve. Joseph Stoll said, Judas made a choice early on that he would not be in this thing for Christ and Christ alone, but he would be in this thing for cash. Christ was a trip down Big Bucks Lane for Judas. See, Judas misunderstood, as did many, misunderstood the nature of the kingdom that Christ was establishing. He expected Jesus to physically overthrow the oppressive, hated Romans and to set up instead an earthly kingdom where he could rule from a palace, probably right there in Jerusalem. And Judas saw himself becoming the top official of the Messiah's kingdom, the treasurer, a rich man. And when he realized that the kingdom of Jesus was spiritual, not earthly, he was bitterly disappointed. Here's the way it's described by Matthew, okay? In Matthew, looking at the 26th chapter and starting in the 14th verse, then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" And so they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. There's the cash. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Don't miss the thens in this passage. Okay? It's the passage starts with then. Well, what happened right before? Well, if you turn the page, you see, or in my case, you turn the page, you look back behind this verse, the story of the woman that anointed him, Mary, anointed him with the expensive perfume. That was like the last straw for Judas. Then, boy, this stubborn resolve really comes up. And then verse 16, once he had the money in his hands, from then on, he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Do you sense, do you feel here the resolve in Judas that's going on? If I can't be a part of an extravagant earthly kingdom, I'll at least get 30 pieces of silver out of this. The time is getting close for the actual moment of betrayal at this point, and just shortly after he's with the other 11 in the upper room, we already were reading that out of the book of John, and that's where he meets the love of Jesus head on. Let's go to the beginning of that chapter. We read some out of the middle. Look at the first verse of chapter 13. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And what takes place then is the washing of the feet. The one who loved them to the end shows his love, and he begins washing their feet one by one. And Judas watches. Judas, who had just been to the Sanhedrin and gotten his 30 pieces of silver, probably had it in his pocket at the time. He watches as the one who loved him to the end washes his feet. And what's going on in Judas? Well, because we know the story, he has to at that point still be remaining fixed, stubborn, focused on the cash. Did Jesus know when he washed Judas's feet that Judas was going to betray him? Of course he did. And he made that very clear, didn't he? Verse 18, I'm not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen, but this is to fulfill this passage of Scripture. He who shared my bread has turned against me. Wow. Verse 21, after he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, one of you is going to betray me. Yeah, Jesus knew. And he gives Judas that bread. We already read that. He gives him that dipped bread, which is a gesture of love, another gesture of love after he's already washed his feet. He gives him the bread as though it's a last-ditch effort to stop the betrayal train. But the love of cash had already gained powerful momentum in Judas. He is in the face of love. He is blindly resolved. He is stubbornly fixed on the cash instead of Christ. And in the countenance of love, he chooses the cash. Brazen, we say. And it is, and it was. Could you do that? Could I do that? Yeah, we could. We could. If we allow the love of cash to grow. Well, you say, how could that be? Let me give you an example of what will allow the cash to grow until you get into that stubborn resolve. If you keep procrastinating about giving, if you keep procrastinating about tithing, do you know that's the one practice, the one habit that can keep our love for cash in its place and can keep our love for Christ in its place? You see, the love of cash invites the betrayal of the Christ. And it begins as well hidden. Others may not see it. Then it develops into a stubborn resolve. And we know, because we know the story, finally it concludes in deep sorrow. Look at verse 30. Chapter 13. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. No, I didn't read that correctly. This is the Apostle John who's writing. What does John love to write about in his gospel and in his letters? Dark and light, darkness and light, sin and righteousness, Satan and Jesus, the kingdom of darkness, the kingdom of light. No, here's how you read that verse. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out. And it was night. Everywhere. Not just the clock. He's referring to so much more here than just the time of day. He's telling us it was night in the soul of Judas. It concludes in deep sorrow. You go back to Matthew again, and you read the final results in chapter 27. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, finally, he was seized with remorse, deep sorrow, and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. And what does Satan always do? When we realize we've been caught in his trap, when we realize that all the fun is over, and now we have to face the real music, what does Satan always do? He does this. What's that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility, not my problem. And right there, Judas could have done what Peter did. He could have been the one that betrayed the Son of God. As was predicted, it would happen. And then he could have turned. But no. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left, and then he went away and hanged himself. Wow. You know, people who are committed to cash always live on the banks of sorrow right next to the river of suicide. People are so committed to the cash, and then it blows up in their face. It blows up in our face. Some of us have had this happen to us. USA reported that nearly half of all adults say that money issues are at the top of the cause of stress for them in their daily lives. We don't have any trouble believing that. But do you love the cash? Paul said to Timothy, and to those to whom Timothy ministered, he said in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, he said, for the love of money, the love of cash, is the root of all kinds of evil. It just goes all these different directions. He says, some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many what? Griefs, sorrows. It always concludes in deep sorrow. Not just grief over bad decisions, not just grief over lost resources, but grief because of the pain that they've caused the people in their lives. You know, the wives and husbands and moms and dads and siblings. The grief that they've caused their fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. And most significantly, the harm they've caused to Christ himself and his kingdom. Betrayal. Are you on the brink of betrayal today? I mean, we may not know it because it begins as very well hidden. And it develops that quiet but stubborn resolve inside. And it concludes in deep sorrow. And you could even be at that point today. You could be today at the point that Judas was when he threw the cash. I can still just see the coins rolling all over the floor, and they don't even bother to pick them up because they don't care. And Judas is broken-hearted. If you're in love with cash, you're living for more and you're getting less. You need to rethink that. You need to rethink your investments, your priorities. You know, the old hymn says, all for Jesus, all my days and all my hours, all for Jesus. That would include my cash. And this song that we sang earlier, that Winston led us in, just says the same message in a different way. Jesus, you are my King. Let's stand together. Let's pray. Dear Lord, get it right in my heart today. Get my priorities where they need to be, Lord. Nobody really knows, Lord, but you and me, where those are. Whatever that may take. Time in the front for prayer. Or how about this? You're struggling with the love of cash and maybe a lot of other stuff because you've never said, Jesus be Lord of my life. You've never made that decision, and you've wandered into church today or were drugged into church by somebody today, and finally you're saying, you know what I need to do? I need to make him king. And then that other stuff can fall into place behind. So you need to make that kind of commitment to Christ today. This song is just for you. For any of you who want to pray, for those of you who are going to stay right where we are and pray this song because it's a prayer, you are my King, Winston will lead us.